Welcome to another podcast conversation. I'm Richard Wolff.
And I'm Harriet H.Fraad.
And today we are going to talk, as the end of the year approaches, about one of the most horrible but also most profoundly significant events of 2012, the shooting death of the children in Newtown, Connecticut, and of the teachers who died with them, and the principal. Not in order to go over the details, they've been covered more than enough in the press and in countless commentaries, but to talk about the larger context which we think helped to bring this horrific event into existence and to its impact on all of us who've thought about it in the weeks since. I'm going to start with the economics that I believe lie behind this sort of event, and this event in particular. Not because the economics is the most important factor, or because it's the key explanation, or anything like that, but because it's not acknowledged as often as it should be. It has become important for us to talk about. And after I say a few words about the economics, Harriet is going to talk in some detail about the psychological, the cultural aspects, dimensions, and causes, and what this event shows us about our psychology and our culture and our politics. So let me begin with the economics. In a capitalist society such as ours, an economic system is allowed to continue that regularly submits people to economic catastrophes. The historical record of 200 years of capitalism indicates business cycles, these periodic plunges into unemployment, business bankruptcy, cut production, wasted, unused resources, and so on. This happens every 3 to 7 years, and that's been true for 200 years. Sometimes these downturns are short and shallow. Other times, like the one we're living through that began in 2007, it's obviously not short and it's obviously not shallow. Millions and millions of people have lost their jobs, been foreclosed out of their homes, and so on. It is one of those downturns which is deep and hits hard and lasts long. But the problem is only beginning when we focus only on economics. What we need to see is what some of the social, political, cultural effects of these crises are. And I think you can see them in a variety of places, including, as I'm going to try to show, the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut. But let's survey some of the effects. We have a society that is apparently numb. What do I mean? Well, the last time we had an economic downturn anywhere near as bad as this one, in the 1930s, the Great Depression, the mass of people rose up through institutions like the CIO, the Socialist and Communist parties, and so on, and demanded that the government not only bail out the banks, not only bail out big corporations, like this time GM, for example, was bailed out, but that it also help the mass of the people. And the government did that. It provided Social Security to older people. We've never done that before. It provided unemployment insurance to workers who lost their job through no fault of their own. We had never done that before. And the federal government created and filled 12.5 million jobs between 1934 and 41. We'd never done that before either. My point is not to go over the details. We've done that in other podcasts. My point is to show that one way you can respond to a crisis that hurts so many people who couldn't possibly be charged with blame for bringing the crisis on. They're the last ones with either the economic or political power to do anything of the sort. They're victims, pure and simple. But this time we're not helping them with the equivalent of Social Security, unemployment insurance, and a jobs program. There is no federal jobs program. None. It isn't even discussed. Instead of enhancing our Social Security, the people in Washington are figuring out how to make us get older before we become eligible, to cut back on the coverage of Medicare, to take away the already inadequate insurance for health reasons provided to poor people through Medicaid. We have large portions of our population supporting the idea that food stamps given to the most desperate of those out of work, marginalized by this economic system, large numbers of people want to cut food stamp support to the neediest amongst us. What is going on? We're worried about a fiscal cliff these days in Washington. And we're talking about how much taxes we're going to raise on people who can't afford to pay the taxes they have now, and how many government programs are going to be cut back at a time when people need them more than ever. What's going on? For this to be the discourse in Washington, for there to be no mass demonstrations demanding jobs the way there were weekly in the Great Depression, means that our population is numb. It is watching a disaster unfold that affects not just those businesses that fire workers, but the families of those businesses, the families of those workers, their neighbors, the communities they live in. We're watching a disaster, a kind of economic tsunami unfold, and we stare at it a little bit like the proverbial deer in the headlights. What's going on? Then there are people who react to the economic crisis in a way that's perhaps worse. They look around for someone to blame. Whoever it is in most cases that they didn't like before, for reasons good or bad. So some people decide to get very angry at immigrants, as if they caused the crisis, as if their activity shaped the problems most American working people have, which even the working people themselves know is absurd. Or they get angry at poor people. Or they get angry at selected bankers as if they, rather than the system that guides what they do, is the problem. They call for criminal prosecutions, as if that's going to solve much. There is a flailing around. It's not numbness, but it's a kind of hysteria, because we're so shocked. We're so frightened. In this time of difficulty, when people are put under extraordinary pressure, the unemployment millions suffer. The unemployment of a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, that millions more suffer. The cutback in government programs, local, state, and federal, that yet millions more have to endure, puts us all under enormous pressure. And yet we are discussing in Washington and at the state level cutbacks in the level of physical and mental health care. What? Are we literally losing our sense of what makes it possible to live in a community? And if we do cut back, what happens then? And now we come to Newtown. People under too much pressure crack, at least those who have a history of problems. Problems that a society should be geared up to identify. Problems that a sane society should be geared up to address, to provide the help and the support to get people out of danger zones. The young man who did the killing in Newtown was living in an impossible situation as Harriet will discuss, with his mother. She couldn't cope with the pressures of her life, and she couldn't cope with her responsibility for him. He was isolated. He didn't get the mental health help that he and his mother needed, and that might have made an enormous difference. We don't provide that in this society. We don't provide the supervision. We abandon people to situations in the home, on the job, in the larger community, that are more than we can expect sizable portions of our people to bear. And if we don't deal with those problems, they will explode. If you're going to keep an economic system that imposes this kind of stress and strain every few years on millions of people, if you're going to keep such an economic system, and in our society we seem afraid, immobilized, to even have a national discussion about alternatives to this system because of its malfunction. But so if we're going to keep it, then we have to provide the context to cope with the problems it imposes on people. We are so afraid of facing the costs of capitalism, and particularly of its periodic downturns, such as the one now ending its 5th year, that we can't allow what this program, this podcast, focuses on, namely, a real honest confrontation with all the damaging social costs imposed by such an economic system. And that includes the people who crack, and whose forms of cracking, responding to the culture and the psychology that Harriet's going to talk about, can destroy our precious children, the viability of our communities, the way we live in a society. And it forces us, and that's our point, to confront what the events in Newtown tell us about the mounting social costs of an economic crisis and of a system that regularly imposes it on us. Final thought. If we face honestly the incalculable costs to which this economic crisis has contributed, in some cases more, in some cases less, we would quickly understand that the costs we bear by not dealing with an economic system that does this to us are far greater than any estimates of what it would cost to keep people working, to provide jobs, and to provide the basic human supports to sustain genuine community. So let me stop there and ask Harriet to weigh in with the psychological and cultural dimensions of the massacre in Newtown, so that those are brought in to round out the picture I've tried to paint of some of the economic roots of that event.
In the 1930s, the United States was not preoccupied with death. I think the preoccupation with death that's everywhere, from the skulls people wear on their scarves and in their jewelry, to the myriad movies about death, the mass trade fiction list of bestsellers of mass trade fiction, mass market fiction in the New York Times, 17 out of 20 of the bestsellers are about death in one way or another. Death is everywhere. And why? I think probably because people feel somewhere, but can't express directly because it's not part of the allowable discussion, that the American dream is dying, and that this society, representing opportunity for the mass of people, That opportunity is dying, and we have to face that. If we look at some of the economics of what's going on, which had not gone on the same way in the 1930s, the United States is dominant in the world militarily and in no other meaningful way right now. We produce the weapons of the world. We have more than all the other armed nations combined in terms of our arsenal, and it's one of the few vital sectors of our society. Military might is everywhere. Invasions are everywhere. Whether it's the drones in Pakistan, the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, the discussion of sending weapons to Mali, and on and on and on. So that's part of it. There's a lot of money in making military equipment. It's our dominant industry. The other thing is that the video games on which Adam Lanza planned his executions, on which he practiced alone in his basement, are a big seller. Video games, killer video games, which are marketed to young males in the society, make enormous profits. Game Boys, which are things you see little boys playing, were designed during the Korean War because they noticed in the military that American soldiers did not want to aim at the head of the opponent. And so they designed means of inuring people to aim at the head, the soldiers to aim at the head and kill the enemy. They then were sold as Game Boys for young boys. So, these are all very profitable. In addition, there's a huge media celebration of death. There are these, Bruce Willis is there, take back your power, holding a large gun. There are the mass killers that are celebrated, like the Terminator or Dirty Harry for the older ones. There are constantly new ones. There is a saturation in death and violence.
If I could just interject an economics note here again. This has to do with the economics of advertising. In a system like ours, we decide as a society to sell airtime, to sell time on the radio and television, and indeed in all the other media, to the highest bidder, the way we sell everything. And here's what that means. The defense industry can buy time for the advertisements that celebrate what it produces for its profit. The gun industry that sells guns to individuals can buy time for the NRA or for the companies to fill the airways with glorifications of what you get from a gun. But who is going to present to the American people equal time, equal skill in developing an argument and presenting it? Who argues that warfare isn't the best way to solve a social problem, or that guns are not a good way to solve personal problems either? The answer is nobody. There's no business engaged in that. And the people who feel that way cannot get together, nor have they the resources organized in the way businesses are to buy advertising to promote their own private profits. So the end result is that these institutions, the military, the gun lobby, they are in a position to basically monopolize or nearly monopolize the public discourse. Not in order to have a position on a point or a point of view, but to promote their businesses without any time or space comparably available and utilized. So we are left with a culture and a society and a psychology shaped not by an ordered discourse about the alternative positions we should consider, but instead by an overwhelming avalanche of what happens to be privately profitable to corporations who shape what we hear and see. And one of the results is that people think it's reasonable to solve political problems militarily and personal problems by killing or shooting the first person you see, or maybe the second. But that's not an accident, and that has to do with the way we allow the public space of our communications with one another to be controlled and dominated by people whose first order of business is making profit and who don't have to worry about or pay the costs of the social damage their profit-seeking advertisement may produce.
A good example of Rick's point is the gun lobby, because one of the reasons that we have a Congress unwilling to pass meaningful protections for us or equal time against the militarism that the powerfully, economically profitable military has, or that the gun lobby exerts, is because our representatives too are influenced by whoever is the highest bidder who can pay for their campaigns. And so that the gun lobby and the NRA's power and money have prevailed in the national discourse in spite of the fact that there is mass killings. We shouldn't forget that there are 180 gun deaths a year of children under 11, mostly by accident, some by homicide, but that's an average, came out from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, not by some kind of anyone with an axe to grind. But that's 180 children. 176 children have been killed by drones in Pakistan this year. 5,000 a year, 5,000 children a year, most of them under 5, are killed through the neglect or abuse by parents or close relatives. And so really, we're talking about mass killing on a level that's very dramatic, even though Newtown's killings were dramatic because they were sudden, because it was a young man who killed them, because they were in an elegant suburb. But nonetheless, death is everywhere, and death of children are everywhere. And those economically profitable forces that control media, that control our representatives, I use the word representative ironically here, that control many of the games, the killer videos, the Game Boys, our programs on television, our advertisements which dominate the television, have to do with killing. And now I would like to go on to a slightly different aspect, which is a gender aspect of what's going on. One of the things that Rick and I have discussed here is that a change that's been brought about by the recession, dramatized in this recession, is that of the 15 jobs that are growing, 13 are dominated by women in the health trades, in the food sector, in services. Men are 4/5 of the people who've been laid off. Therefore, and there are two perks that have gone with traditional manhood in America, particularly white manhood. None of the mass killers are black. In any case, one of them is access to women, and another is access to power. Those are perks of male power. Well, increasingly women don't want to have men around who demand a lot of domestic and emotional services and can't support them. In fact, who require support. And so women are rejecting men on a level they never have before. 42% of births are outside of a marriage. Women are the ones refusing marriage. These show up in things like Bride magazine, which is failing. In any case, all these brides magazines that they used to have, which were so popular, there's a gender dynamic in which men who feel dispossessed are recapturing their power and their manhood at the mouth of a gun. In a brief study that I did of a month's worth of killings from 2 people on, all of the men had been rejected by a girlfriend or wife in the previous months. Even the guy who killed the Sikhs, who he hated, had been thrown out by his girlfriend shortly before he did that. Adam Lanza was not rejected by a woman. He never got out of the house to meet one. The only woman he saw was his mother. So that we're talking about a male definition as being male because you have power, and having freedom because you have a gun. And when you feel denied of your manhood as a provider, looking for a way to reclaim that manhood at the mouth of a gun may be tempting.
You know, the NRA's advertisements and those of allied institutions often have the thematic that you are vulnerable if you do not possess a gun, and you become powerful, self-reliant, independent if you do. And there's a constant notion that you are at risk and endangered if you do not possess a gun, whereas you overcome those problems if you possess one. The idea that everyone possessing a gun would constitute an enormous risk to you is carefully avoided. It is always the vulnerable individual who overcomes his or her...
Vulnerable man, we should say.
Particularly the man who overcomes it by acquiring a gun. And of course the link there to the United States having problems in the world and solving it by guns is unmistakable.
It's also unmistakable, but it's one of these hidden in full sight phenomena that all of the mass killers, with the exception of one about 30 years ago, have been men. All men. Now think, nobody makes much remark about this. However, if let's say all of the killers were black women, there would be quite a bit of discussion of that. Or if they were all women, or if they were all black, wow, that would be an enormous topic. But the fact that they're white men with guns is kind of taken as normal. It's not anything to remark about, but of course it's remarkable that that is the refuge for white men. Although there have been a few Asians, they're overwhelmingly white men to take power in this society. And so that the changed gender relations through the rich people's profit decision to outsource people's jobs, to eliminate the U.S. manufacturing sector that employed millions of blue-collar men, and which was allowed. After all, it's more profitable to go to China. So what if it destroys a community? So what if the stores die? So what if it destroys families? It's more profitable. So, of course, there's nothing to stop it like there is in Germany, which is doing quite well economically and has very, very powerful runaway shop laws which make it almost impossible to leave. So we're also talking about that freedom mixed with a kind of strange gender revenge on the part of men, particularly white men. We also have to look at something else, which is the position of children in the United States. The basic supposition of the family is that if you're capable of the biological act of conception, you will be ipso facto capable of the 24-hour care of a vulnerable life and shepherding a child through early childhood and adolescence as a productive human being. That's bizarre. Just because you can get knocked up doesn't mean, it's a vulgar word, but I mean mistakenly conceived doesn't mean that you're capable of taking care of anybody. It often means that you're not even capable of using birth control and taking care of yourself, no less anybody else. And so that supposition is bizarre. And abandoning children who have no recourse to their families is bizarre.
To people who can't perhaps take care of them, who can't perhaps understand them, who don't perhaps want at this point in their lives to do that, is an unspeakable condemnation of both the child and the parents to a nexus of work and responsibility that neither of them are equipped to handle. And the outcome is going to be a disaster. And it's a disaster, again, that we can see coming and ought not to be immobilized from talking about and trying to find a solution.
One of the things that comes up is the slaughter of the innocents that happens every year, that 180 children under 11 die of firearm deaths in the United States. That's outrageous. It's mainly neglect. They're left alone, there's guns around. Just as Adam Lanza played his video games alone in his basement, right near his mother's gun collection, including the assault weapon with which he killed 20 children, and the Glock pistol with which he killed himself. 5,000 children a year die of neglect and abuse because their parents can't cope and there's one person they can take it out on. That added problem that's a child. We don't address that. In the case of Adam Lanza, he was obviously a disturbed adolescent. The school acknowledged he was disturbed. He didn't talk to anyone. Even when he had to make a presentation in class, he made it on a computer with a pointer and would not say a word. He was allowed to go home with his mother and get no mental health care and be locked in the house with his mother, who let no one else in the house. He did not leave the house except to go shooting with his mother, and stayed in a windowless basement playing violent video games. Who would supervise him? I'm sure the school recommended mental health care. It's probably one of the reasons he was withdrawn. The principal is not alive to tell you. Neither is the guidance counselor. They were both shot by him. But this is obviously a case of an accident waiting to happen. A good example in New York, where someone just, the second person in a month, was pushed off the subway platform, is that with the flooding of the last two floods we've had, Bellevue, a big mental health hospital, is closed. So is Coney Island with all their outpatient services. People aren't getting their stabilizing meds. They're not being seen. They're not being helped. They're wandering all over the city. And that's not a priority of our billionaire mayor, Mike Bloomberg. So that we have a combination of neglected children, no accessible, insistent mental health care for children. In France, child care for children under 3 is universal. 100% are in excellent child care. And if they notice aberrational children, they are given counseling. That is an initiative of the school. This is a social problem. They can recognize that. Of course, we could too. So that what I'm saying is that there is this confluence of factors in our society which goes to the highest bidder, regardless of mental health care, child vulnerability, help for people, kindness, and all the values we say we believe in. And that is a combination of neglect by an economy that goes to the highest bidder, by a gun culture and celebration of military solutions, even if they're no doubt failing, as Iraq and Afghanistan are failing, and the drone war is failing, and they continue. Profitable killer videos, profitable Game Boys, profitable gun lobby, profitable guns pushed on children. That this is, and also the social neglect of our children, our families, that these things all shape each other, and they all went to shape the deaths of the 27 people that were killed in Newtown, Mass, by Adam Lanza, including himself.
I wanted to come back with an example again about the absurdity of allowing the community's resource, the airwaves, the TV, broadband, and so on, to be monopolized by people who are trying to make money by what they show and what they say. And if we don't deal with that, we're not going to solve major problems. If we don't have a new way of organizing what's discussed and how the different points of view are articulated, and I have no problem with those who want to make a point of view that guns should be universal, and so that's fine. Let them have equal access to present their arguments, to be confronted by people who disagree with them, who can also present their arguments in a fair and equal way, and then let people make up their minds. But don't allow one side of the debate, funded by enormous billion-dollar corporations with pots of money that they're willing to spend because it's going to make it back in profits, where there's nothing comparable on the other side. If we don't deal with that, we're going to have gun violence and these horrible examples, especially in a country placed under economic stress the way our system does. The perfect example is the obesity crisis in America. We permit the purveyors of the worst conceivable food in terms of its caloric impact to flood the airways with advertisements about the joys and benefits of that kind of drink. There is no comparable presentation, not as flamboyant, not as often, not as carefully designed. On the other side, in a perfect example, a couple of months ago in New York City, an effort was made to limit the ability of fast food outlets to sell enormous caloric soda pop on the grounds that it was a major factor in childhood obesity. Unabashedly, in our free enterprise system, large corporations were able to mount a very well-funded counterattack. And I remember walking down 6th Avenue in Manhattan and watching one after another of the city buses go by, mounted with huge advertisements that ran as follows: "Don't let anyone tell you what you're allowed to drink." Wow. That's playing on people's feeling that everybody is telling them what to do and their lives are falling apart. For a child, it may mean, I want the freedom to drink until I'm so fat I can't walk. But for another person, it might mean, I'm not going to let anyone take away from me the gun that can make me less vulnerable, less at risk in this risk-laden society that I now feel. We're going to have weird solutions found by individuals and groups to their problems because we permit the social space of our community to be monopolized in terms of the arguments spread by people who have a profit-driven vested interest to spend the money to monopolize that. That's a very strange way to organize social life.
It's really what we're talking about is democracy. Free enterprise means that wealth is free to control the society, and those wealthy interests are free to buy our airwaves and to buy our minds and to buy our representatives. It's a dictatorship of the corporate profits. And we have to take back our democracy so that all ideas are represented.